Okay, so please enjoy our presentation. Oops, let me see, can I? Okay. Brian, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Niall. So as we all know, I mean, we have the choice between commercial textbooks or self-created materials. Um, and while commercial textbooks are the primary source for most teachers, many teachers also do enjoy developing or feel the need to develop their own materials. And that can be very useful because it suits the local context. Uh, in, um, in a Tomlinson paper going back to 2010, there was a big majority, there was 78% of ESL teachers were not satisfied with the course book they were using. And we were interested to see, is this the case in Japan too? And Alan Maley, around the same time, he pointed out that these materials treat all learners the same. And it's sort of inevitable. Big producers, big publishers like OUP, like National Geographic, they're trying to sell books all around the world. And of course, there has to be a lot of teaching to the lowest common denominator. So there is a lot of sameness, and they treat all learners the same. In the Japanese context, as Niall said, there is a bit of a lack of research into the process of materials creation. We've both been involved in materials for a long time, and we know a lot of people who are involved in it, but there isn't really sufficient understanding of what teachers are doing and how they're creating materials, and we're interested in that process. In particular, we're wondering how that teaching material creation can benefit by following a framework. And we're just going to introduce a framework very briefly. You're muted, Niall.
That was probably better to be muted. As Brian mentioned there, yes, there's a materials development framework that Brian and I have used in the past. This is from Jolly and Bolito from 2011. And as you can see here, it starts off with identification of needs for materials, which I'm sure we all agree with as a first step in producing materials. We look at the need of the students. And then it progresses through that, through 7 steps, and eventually ends with the evaluation stage. Or sorry, evaluation stages. Or in the 6th step, evaluation of materials against agreed objectives. Sorry, there is a 7th step that was added a bit later to that. But in this one here, it's 6 steps. And as you can see, you progress. It's not a non-linear process. So there is some jumping around. You can go from identification of need to exploration, or you can jump to the contextual realization, production of materials. So it's a non-linear process. So this is one Brian and I have found useful in the past. There are others that are available out there, but this is one that we have used. So for our study, we wanted to research materials use among teachers in Japan. So of course it's a vast area. So we decided to focus it with 3 research questions. The first research question was, do teachers feel that coursebook meet the needs of their students, or would they prefer to develop their own materials? And then the second question was, what do teachers find most challenging about developing their own materials? And the last one, do teachers follow a materials development framework? When designing their materials. So these were our 3 research questions that guided the study. And our methodology, Brian?
So for the methodology, we used a very simple approach. We used the questionnaire. It was an anonymous questionnaire using both open and closed-ended questions. And it was to try and gather data to answer those research questions. In total, we had 20 participants. As all the questions were optional, some respondents left some of the questions unanswered. We administered it through Google Forms, and we collected a sample of participants through personal contacts, through social media like Facebook, and then also through what we call snowball sampling, by basically asking people to recommend other people. There were occasions of overlap here. Here, Niall has put up the slide of where people are working. So you can see that the vast majority of them, about 13 out of the whole sample, were teaching at university. But probably Pansig is probably university dominated as well. So this is probably of most interest to people here as well. There was some overlap. Some people worked at university and privately, or at university and at high school. Can we go on to the next one or not?
Yes, thanks, Brian. So the results.
I'll just add one other point.
Okay.
Can we just go back to the previous one?
Of course.
We also asked teachers how much experience they had in developing materials. And it was actually a very high level. It was 90% of them had more than 7 years experience in designing materials. Mm-hmm. The remaining 10% indicated less than 1 year. So that high level of experience, it probably indicates a prior interest in materials development, which resulted in more experienced materials developer taking the questionnaire. So we have a bit of self-selection bias within the data. We recognize that.
Okay, thanks, Brian. As regards the responses to our research questions, so do teachers feel the course would meet the needs of their students? These are the results that we found from our sample. So as you can see from the graph here, the majority of teachers are quite satisfied with the textbook they're currently using. This is in contrast to what Tomlinson found in 2010, where he, as Brian mentioned, he reported 78% of teachers are not content with the materials they're using. So this was quite surprising to Brian and us that actually the majority are satisfied with it. But only one teacher indicated that actually they're extremely satisfied with the materials they're using. This was all positive until the second part of that question. So given the choice, would you prefer to use a course book or develop your own materials? So the results here were quite interesting, and they were in line with Tomlinson's finding in 2010. So most of the teachers prefer to make their own material, given the choice. So this teacher here, I prefer to develop my own because no textbook can satisfy my needs. By far, I prefer to use my own textbook or my own materials. Getting to know my students well and target their specific needs is a key part of my teaching strategy. This one here is quite interesting. The downside being that it can take a lot of time to learn a student that well. And time was a recurrent theme with difficulties, which we'll see in a moment, among teachers when developing materials. Another teacher developed my own stuff every time, no question. So as you can see, even though the results were that they're happy with their textbooks, most teachers would prefer to make their own materials. But there were some other teachers who were quite happy to use the materials and supplement them with their own activities. For example, the course book acts as a base that can be expanded upon. And this teacher here, I would ideally spend 3 lessons on the course book and every 4th lesson doing activities with my own materials and tasks. Regarding research question 2, what do teachers find most challenging about developing their own materials? As I alluded to earlier, not enough time to develop materials was a recurring theme. Maybe 13 or so respondents said that. Others, difficult to know the appropriate level of the students. It's difficult to think of ideas. And there are other answers as well in there. But as you can see, what jumps off the screen is not enough time to develop materials. And research question 3, do teachers follow materials development framework when designing their materials? Here we have yes and no. So yes was over 50%, with no just less. This again was quite interesting for Brian and us, that the divide here, there was a clear disparity between those who do and those who don't develop the materials or adhere to a framework when they develop their materials. So if they don't use materials development framework, how do teachers go about developing their own materials? So they expanded upon this, which Brian will explain about now.
Thanks, Niall. From their answers, we developed 4 themes to describe the approaches that people are taking to materials design. So we have the 4 approaches. Can we actually put up the 4 straight away, Niall? Thanks.
Yes, Brian, no problem.
So we have people who are informed by a theory. people who are taking simply a practical approach, people who are working within the confines of a set curriculum, and then people who are guided by their own interest. And of course, there is overlap between these, and that's natural. But for the sake of this discussion, we decided to separate them out. So if we start with the theory-informed approach, some of the teachers, as we saw, are very familiar with materials development already, and some of them are already aware of the literature in materials development. For example, respondent 4 says that my approach has a lot of adaptation from Tomlinson's developing materials for language teaching. Others have ended up at theory because they developed their own approach through trial and error, but then they recognize a lot of the same steps within the established framework. For example, respondent 7 says, though this is my first time to be introduced to the framework, it seems that I have been using the steps. So here we're seeing this convergence of practice and theory, which makes sense because materials development, much more than a lot of areas within foreign language pedagogy, it's fundamentally a practical area. And even the developers of the framework regard it as simply a description of what happens in practice. The second approach was the practical approach. Teachers who have very little interest in theory, and instead they tend to be very goal-driven. So one participant summarized it as goal first, realistic journey to get there, non-linear, try a few things in class, see what sticks, build from there. And this non-linear classroom-driven route, it might not be the fastest way to produce materials, but it can be highly effective in addressing the needs, the very specific needs of any group of students or any learning context. And even Jolly and Belito recognized their own framework was non-linear and that it jumped back and forth from stage to stage. The third approach was curriculum-driven. And probably many of us are working in a situation where there is a curriculum, but we have a certain amount of freedom to develop or use other materials within that curriculum. For example, respondent 10 says that after checking the curriculum, I identify topics covered and then create materials to make class more personalized for the students I'm teaching, which sounds like a very, very useful approach. Similarly, respondent 17, who's teaching kids, comments that the common materials development pattern is to follow the monthly or seasonal theme, which is set by the curriculum, work in grammar, plenty of hands-on for young learners and repetition, using various senses to reinforce new grammar, making it fun to learn. So we see this, people are using their creativity to implement the curriculum in a more interesting way. The final one is guided by own interest. Now, initially that sounds a bit selfish. For example, we have one respondent saying, first, I find a topic that interests me. Secondly, I consider how to introduce the topic, either through picture, song, brainstorm, etc. Now, we can probably all remember teachers who were very enthusiastic about a subject. I know in my own schooling, those were the teachers that I learned the most from. Enthusiasm is a big part of teaching. And so when the teacher starts from their own interest, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Students tend to be most motivated by teachers who are highly interested. And research by Mahler and Harms in 2018, it does show a positive relationship between teachers' enthusiasm and student performance. So it is something to keep in mind too. Our own interests are important. You're muted, Niall.
I'm sorry, Brian. Let me move on then. But of course, like any study, we have our limitations in this study. Of course, one major limitation is a small number of respondents. We did send it out through our social media and snowball sampling, but we only had 20 respondents, which is quite small. So it's very hard to draw any conclusions from that sample size. Also, the demographic of the respondents were mostly university teachers, as Brian mentioned earlier. So we would like in future to incorporate more maybe kindergarten teachers, elementary teachers, junior and high school teachers, and also private language teachers too, to get a fuller representation of how those teachers develop the materials. Also, a further limitation was a lack of explanation of framework in the questionnaire we designed. We didn't spend much time actually outlining what a framework was. So those people who did not know what the framework was maybe had some difficulty responding to that question. Also, the data was only from a questionnaire. So in future studies, we would open it up to maybe JALT or the PANSIG, the special interest group within JALT. We try and broaden our scope of teachers there with that. So these were some limitations from our study. Brian, are you there?
I am. Thanks. I can just put it all up there. Thanks. So here, what we've been trying to do in this study and in this presentation is just provide a glimpse into materials development among ESL teachers in Japan. And it did surprise us. Teachers in general are overall satisfied with their current textbook, which is at odds with what Tomlinson was saying. Now, teachers do also have a preference for self-developed materials. And as Niall said earlier, one of the clear problems with creating their own materials is time. And teachers find they don't have enough time. We noticed a clear difference between teachers who are guided by a materials development framework and those that are not. And we're not necessarily saying that following a framework produces better results, but it can certainly produce a more systematic process. And we felt that we would like to delve a bit more deeper and try and find out what actual process people are really following. One important thing that emerged from this was the lack of the emphasis on evaluation. It's all very well creating materials. So we start with the student needs, for example, in Jolly and Belito. We follow through, we create the materials, we use them in the classroom. But unless we evaluate them in some way, there is really no way to check that student needs are being met and that the materials are effective. So one possible advantage of following a materials development framework is it could ensure that evaluation is more systematically included. And that's probably something that materials developers should be more aware of. Now, we'd like to take this a little deeper, not today, but in future research, we would like to do some closer case studies of material writers, to interview them, maybe do some verbal protocols, reminisce, have them remember how they created it. By doing that, we think that we can gain a deeper understanding of the actual processes followed. And then we can see how closely these correspond to the materials development frameworks. And perhaps the materials development frameworks can be made more useful based on the practical experience of material writers in Japan. So I see we have a couple of questions coming in. I'm just going to read the question that appeared in the chat. In the questionnaire, read textbook satisfaction, were respondents able to comment on who selected the textbook? I.e., were they satisfied with textbooks they'd selected or were selected with someone else? No, we did not provide an option for that. And that is a very good point. Because if something is imposed by somebody else, I think there is a bit of human instinct to not like it as much as if you chose it yourself. We have, I believe we have about 4 minutes left. Is that right?
There is about 4 minutes left.
4 minutes, Brian. Yes. Any questions?
Let me first turn off the recording.